Hi and welcome. My name is Kris Sazaki and I'm one half of the Pixeladies.
And I'm Deb Cashatt, the other half. We're hosting today's Textile Talk on behalf of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Today we're delighted to introduce the presentation, Women's Suffrage, It's Complicated. Contemporary Artists Re-Examine the Suffrage Movement. For those of you who are joining for the first time, Textile Talks is a weekly virtual lecture series presented by 6 different fiber art organizations each Wednesday. They are Studio Art Quilt Associates, the International Quilt Museum, Surface Design Association, Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, and the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Today's presentation and Q&A session will last about an hour. If you'd like to ask a question, submit it in the Q&A area on your screen, and we'll get back to them at the end of the presentation. We are proud to be supported by the following organizations and businesses.
Come on.
Orfil, Handy Quilter, The Quilt Show, Misty Fuse, Artistic Artifacts, Schiffer Publishing, eQuilter, Moda Fabrics and Supplies, 9 Patch Fabrics, and C&T Publishing. In a moment, we'll have our invited speakers, Pam Weeks and Alice Beasley, present on their work and the museum's upcoming exhibition, Deeds Not Words, celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage. Pending the museum's reopening, Deeds Not Words will be on view at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, October 16th through December 6th of this year. It's also available on our website as a virtual exhibition. We're pleased to announce that the labels are in 3 different languages, so please check it out when you have time. We'll put a link to it in the chat box. We'll also be sharing a link to some exciting virtual events happening at our museum in the next few weeks, including an artist development workshop with San Francisco Bay Area artist Stephen C. Wagner, and a series of workshops with our newly launched Digital Artist in Residence program.
And Pam, if you can change the slide. Great. And now I'm honored to introduce today's speakers, Pam Weeks and Alice Beasley. Pam is the Binney family curator at the New England Quilt Museum. She is the co-organizer of Deeds Not Words, along with Sandra Sider, the curator of the Texas Quilt Museum. Pam regularly works with quilters, collectors, institutions, and co-conspirators to plan exhibits and conduct research on the quilts in the museum's collection. 2 of her research projects have been published in Uncoverings, the peer-reviewed publication of the American Quilt Study Group. Her first book was published in 2011 on Civil War quilts made for soldiers, and 2 more are on the way. Our second speaker is Alice Beasley, a San Francisco Bay Area-based artist whose work will be on view in this exhibition. Alice has been making portraits of people and objects in fabric since 1988 and has exhibited her work in many venues throughout the United States, including the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., the American Folk Art Museum in New York, and the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum, as well as abroad in Madrid, France, Japan, Namibia, and Croatia. We're excited to have them both here to talk about this amazing and important, and I should say timely exhibition. So Pam, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for featuring this exhibit and for inviting me to speak. Sandra Sider and I were invited to curate this exhibit of art quilts to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. We each invited 15 artists to submit works, resulting in 28 works from 29 artists. We are indebted to Luana Rubin of eQuilter, who became the exclusive sponsor. Many thanks to Carrie Bresenham and Nancy O'Brien Puentes, who offered the resources of the Texas Quilt Museum to manage and ship the show. So Sandra and I split up the work, although she did the lion's share in organizing the exhibit and the accompanying book. She wrote the general introduction to the volume, which accompanies it, and asked me to write just a 1,000-word essay on the history of the battle for women's rights. So I read 8 or 10 books, and I've never done anything harder then transferring that knowledge and information into that short essay. What I discovered was completely different than what I learned in school. The history of the fight for the vote for women was long, complicated, nuanced, racist, exclusionary, elegant, violent, and worth really digging into on your own. We've included a bibliography in the book that would make a good start to your exploration. And I've also been re-watching The Vote on PBS, which is a really well done documentary and covers an awful lot of the complication. So what is suffrage? Merriam-Webster defines it in the first definition as a short intercessory prayer, but the second and third definitions deal with our topic, which is voting. A vote given in deciding a controverted question or electing a person for an office or trust. And the third definition is the right to vote and the exercise of such right. The 19th Amendment, the wording was actually written probably in the late 19th century, but it was not passed until the 1920s, and I'm not going to read to you what's on the screen. But the most important part for us right now to understand is that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, which was the major change at the time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were the only two names that I remembered learning about in school, but the fight for women's suffrage and rights started well before them. At the founding of the Constitution, Abigail Adams wrote the following advice to her husband, John, one of the founding fathers. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She was, of course, ignored. In 1776 and before, the American laws were based on the precedent of British law, and only men who owned property, mainly white, Protestant, and over 21 had the right to vote. It shocked me, some of the stuff that I found out I was doing this research. Only 6% of the population was eligible to vote for George Washington, our first United States president. And here's where the kicker was that caused so much of the problem. The founders, in the words of one pundit that I listened to in the last couple of weeks, drop-kicked the issue of voting to the individual states to determine who could vote, and over time, suffrage was extended to all white men, not just property owners, but not to women. I was particularly surprised to find out that Native Americans were not granted citizenship until 1925. And although Black men were granted the citizenship in 1868, and Black women were included in the 19th Amendment in 1920, many obstacles were put in their way when they tried to vote. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the Jim Crow laws and other impediments were removed. So we're going to go through one more general slide on history, and then we're going to jump into the quilts. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is pictured on the right with her daughter, Harriet. And I chose this picture because the fight for women's suffrage was multi-generational. And her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, was one of the women working doggedly in the movement when the 19th Amendment was finally passed. And that's her sitting as a baby in her mother's lap. So Cady Stanton was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, which was held in New York in 1848. But she was not the first person to speak openly about rights and suffrage. Many were engaged fighting for social change in the early years of the 19th century. The issues included slavery, temperance, religious reform, and women's rights. Stanton, with other women at a pre-meeting, pre-event meeting, drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which included issues, which included issues about the other rights denied to women, such as owning property once married, the right to an education, the job of her choice, the right for equal pay for equal work, which we're still fighting for, and if divorced, a woman lost the legal custody of her children, even if she had divorced her husband for, say, drunkenness or cruelty. Frederick Douglass, a free Black man, was one of the few who attended the Seneca Falls event and was a signer of the Declaration of Sentiments. Stanton's own husband did not support her work and did not attend the convention. Sojourner Truth was a Black female anti-slavery advocate. Other Black men, but especially many Black women, were written out of the documented history by white historians later in that century. There are now many books and articles available addressing a much wider and more inclusive history of the various movements and how they resulted in the 19th Amendment. What surprised me about Seneca Falls were that many resolutions were passed by those in attendance concerning women's rights, but suffrage was not one of them. All right, we're going to share a few of the works in the exhibit to highlight some of the leaders. I've arranged them in a loose chronological order, and I believe we're taking questions at the end. Kris, is that right? Yeah, all right. So I'm not supposed to have favorites. All of the quilts are my favorites, but I'm particularly drawn to this piece by Shin Hee Choi about the Grimm Sisters. It turns out by accident about 5 or 6 years ago, I read a wonderful historical novel about the Grimm Sisters. They were some of the earliest anti-slavery workers. They were born in South Carolina into a slave-holding family, but very early left that state, moved north, and freed, I believe, their personal slaves. So I'm going to go back and forth between my own words and reading the words of the artists. Shin Hee writes that they dedicated their entire lives through lectures and education to address the injustice of enslavement and women's subjugation. They are credited as seeing the women's rights issue as a human rights issue. She writes, "My work, The Grimm Sisters, attempts to highlight women's independence and creativity that refuse to be restricted by old customs, prejudice, and discrimination." Now, this is quite a large piece. It's 5 feet by 5 feet, and it is all stitched by hand. But to do the images of the letters, she oversprayed, probably using stencils to block the areas that she didn't want colored. And that's just an amazing piece. From a distance, you cannot see the stitches, but the closer you come into it, the more clear they are. Susan Lentz chose to honor Lucy Stone, who was one of the earliest women's rights activists. In 1850, 2 years after the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, Stone organized the first National Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, that had a much broader scope. It brought women in from all over the country. She became a prominent speaker, and her speeches were reprinted in the international press. And here's what Susan writes about her work. "From the beginning, I knew that I wanted to create a hinged work that referenced antique daguerreotypes. This early photographic process employed an iodine-sensitized silver plate and mercury vapor to create a very fragile mirror-like surface with extremely accurate and sharp details. Because the plates were so vulnerable to damage, most were presented in special folding cases, often with velvet liners and ornate clasps. I selected Lucy Stone because she refused to give up her surname upon marriage. And she and her husband Henry wrote their own egalitarian wedding vows and penned a famous protest against patriarchal laws and customs governing marriage. Lucy Stone stood against all inequalities." If you have the chance to see these pieces in person, this piece is just stunning. The back of the daguerreotype case that looks exactly like leather is cotton. And I believe that Susan did photo transfer and then worked with her quilting to make it look really, really three-dimensional. And in the area of the photograph of Lucy Stone, she gilded it, in quotes, with gold buttons. Those are all buttons that are arranged around that. Jill Pertula chose to honor Belva Lockwood, and I will just read you her words. In 1884, at age 53, before women had the right to vote, Belva Lockwood ran a nationwide campaign as a presidential candidate for the Equal Rights Party. As she said in one interview, "I cannot vote, but I can be voted for." As the first woman allowed to practice at the bar of the Supreme Court, she knew the constitutionality of her endeavor. There had been other fledgling campaigns supported by suffragist and prohibition groups, but none with the reach, support, and credibility of Belva Lockwood. And I'll throw in a historian's comment here. I was watching the vote last night and had forgotten how it was the men's fear of losing their alcohol that blocked the work of women's suffrage for a good long time. All right, slide number 10 is Arturo. Yes.
I just want to ask you if you could move your papers slightly away from the microphone. People
Yes.
are having a little difficulty. Thank you.
Okay, I can do without holding the paper up there. Arturo Alonso Sandoval titled his piece, Unsung Heroes of African-American Suffrage. He was researching the suffragist Ethel Williams of Detroit, Michigan, and it led him to discover that many women of African-American descent who participated in the women's suffrage movement. And in his words, "I felt compelled to include many of these women who, overall, were forgotten due to the racism of the time. Since Black suffragists were not given their rightful place among the main women's suffrage movement marches, I chose to include as many as I could in this memorial quilt, paying homage to their valiant efforts in helping push through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution." And the book has an appendix in which all of these women are listed. Sandra Sider did a wonderful photo transfer piece honoring Frances Watkins Harper, I Speak of Wrongs. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper spent her entire adult life struggling for racial equality as well as women's suffrage, with racial equality at the forefront of her efforts. Bundle of Humanity in my quilt comes from her 1866 speech at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, and the strength of her convictions can be felt in the core sentence of that speech. "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." Other speakers that day included Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This event established Harper's prominence as an orator among feminist leaders, and she did not hesitate to criticize racist attitudes among the suffragists. And now, Alice, you're on.
Okay, let me unmute myself. Good morning, afternoon, whatever the case may be. My quilt is called She Refused to Walk Behind, and it's about Black suffragist Ida B. Wells and the famous 1913 suffragist parade in Washington, D.C. Now, some context is required to understand the image and why I've depicted the movement, figuratively and literally turning its back on Black women. Prior to the Civil War, abolitionists and suffragists generally forged a common cause because neither Blacks nor women were accorded full citizenship in society. So it was natural that they joined together for the advancement of civil rights for all. Legendary abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison were also staunch women's suffrage advocates. And most women's suffrage advocates during this time also pushed for the abolition of slavery. But after the Civil War, the nation turned its attention briefly to Reconstruction in the South, and among other constitutional amendments, the 15th Amendment was adopted, granting Black men, at least theoretically, the right to vote. Some of the stalwart white suffragists, however, were outraged that Black men had been given the right to vote ahead of white women. This racial discomfort led Alice Paul, a white supremacist, who would eventually break with the National American Women's Suffragist Association, to form the more radical National Woman's Party, to organize a faction of feminists who wanted to ensure that abolition and suffrage were not viewed as interlocking causes, so as not to lose the support of racists in their midst. But by 1877, the North had totally abandoned its support for Reconstruction, and the South was left to treat its former slaves as it pleased, which resulted in the adoption of repressive Jim Crow laws, effectively imposing second-class status on all Black people within the borders of the Southern states for the next 80+ years. Unfortunately, some of the leaders of women's suffrage movement, including such famous names as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, thought it more advantageous to court the support of Southern racists, even if it was at the expense of the interests of Black women. But Black women nevertheless remained active in the movement for women's suffrage and gave their hearts and their minds and their intellects and their bodies to the cause of women's suffrage, because they saw voting not just as an abstract right, but as a matter of life or death for Black people. So that brings us to this quilt. It's entitled "She Refused to Walk Behind," and depicts one incident in this lesser known battle within the suffragist movement involving Black civil rights activist and journalist Ida B. Wells. That's her shown at the bottom right of the quilt. Wells was already a national figure and a outspoken and courageous journalist who campaigned against lynching when she, at the time that she traveled to the 1913 Washington, D.C. march to join the 5,000 to 10,000 women who would march for women's suffrage on that day. She arrived with a delegation of members from the Alpha Suffrage Club of Black women that she had founded in Chicago. Wells was told by the head of the Illinois delegation that the national organization wanted to keep the delegation entirely white. And so she was told that she would be required to walk, she and the other Black participants would be required to walk at the end of the parade, behind the men, in a separate colored section. But Ida B. Wells refused. Instead of going to the back with the other African Americans, Wells waited with spectators as the parade was underway. And you can see the spectators that I've shown on the left-hand side. When the Illinois delegation was passing by, she quietly stepped out of the crowd and took her place in and among the marchers and strode with them into history. The white suffragists should have known that in Wells they were messing with the wrong lady. In 1884, 71 years before Rosa Parks, a conductor on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad ordered Wells out of the first-class ladies' car, even though she had a first-class ticket. When she refused, they forcibly removed her from the train. But Ida B. Wells sued the railroad and won in the trial court, only to have the case reversed on appeal by the Tennessee Supreme Court. Although the suffrage movement was populated with many heroines, in reality, it was much more complex and often turbulent when it came to the relationship between white suffragist leaders and Black women. It was not immune from the racism that blanketed the nation. And while we honor the movement's past, we should also acknowledge its flaws, as well as some of the Black heroines of the suffrage movement. Women such as Elizabeth Piper Inslee, who fought for and won full suffrage for women of all races in Colorado in 1893, or Sarah Massey Overton, who fought for the vote in California in the early years of the 20th century, or Naomi Anderson, who gave a fiery, controversial speech at the first Women's Rights Convention in Chicago in 1869, or Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and many others. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, its leaders went home. Job well done. But what they failed to realize was that for Black women living in the Jim Crow South, it would take another 45 years and the passage of the Voting Rights Act for them to attain the simple right to vote. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them if you put them into the Q&A box. Back to Pam.
Or back to the Pixeladies.
Back to the Pixel persons.
So we came to do Catherine Dexter McCormick because this photo of her, the original photo of her, stood on our design wall for, I don't know, Deb, 10 years. Deb discovered her by looking, just discovered her at one point, and we just really wanted to work on her. So we actually came to this exhibit kind of through the back door, because when Sandra and Pam asked us to do a piece, Deb said, we've been wanting to do this piece forever. And since she was also a suffragist, we asked, could we do a piece on Catherine McCormick? So Deb, why don't you tell a little bit about the why of her?
Okay, and Jackie Benedetti had a question. Did each participant pick their own topic, or were they given a list to choose from? So the answer is yes. So we were given a list, and Kris and I said, well, I said, I will only do this if we can do Catherine McCormick. So that's how that came about. She was not only a suffragist, she was a really overall women's rights advocate. She was one of the privileged white people. And when I say privileged, this woman was very rich. So most of her work was behind the scenes, and she funded all sorts of things, from women's dormitories at MIT to birth control, to the birth control pill, and just art galleries, scholarships for women to medical school, all kinds of things like that. So that's why we were really excited to do her.
Right, and it's interesting that we talk about the fact of how privileged she was. She was a daughter of a very wealthy banker, and married into the McCormick family. And for those of you who went to school, we're talking about the McCormick Reaper family. So she was obscenely wealthy, and she took that money and spent it really on advancing women's rights. So while she did have a tremendous amount of privilege, we don't want to forget, how much she put into really putting to the forefront the concept of women's sovereignty over themselves and their bodies. And so, so that's about where we are. So we can answer more questions since we're here. So we want to let you go ahead, Pam. And if you are interested in how we actually put the piece together, we did an interview with Lisa Walton, and it's up on the New England Quilt Museum's website.
The link is, yes. I just want to interject here. I said I read 8 or 10 books. One of my favorites is called Gilded Suffragists. And it's about how the movement morphed from, and this is going to sound derogatory, but I don't mean it that way. It was the blue stockings, the Elizabeth Cady Stantons, the Susan B. Anthonys, were not considered fashionable. But when the fashionable women, the rich, privileged women of New York, and other women like Catherine Dexter McCormick got into the fight, they had already for many years been managing the press. there was paparazzi then. And when these women began to become interested in suffrage and women's rights, they dragged the press along with them, and they managed their messages beautifully. And the historian who wrote Gilded Suffragists would argue that it wasn't until these rich and privileged high society women became involved that it really put the effort over the top. So speaking of that, let me go to the next quilt, which is Federation Gertie by Hollis Chatelaine. And I see I've forgotten to put the dimensions on this one. It's here on this crowded desk somewhere. If anybody really cares, we'll find it later. I'm going to use Hollis's words. Gertrude Weil was from an affluent Jewish family that allowed her to have a privileged white lifestyle. She was quite striking physically, and the pictures I could find often showed her beautifully dressed. Even though she was quite humble, her natural leadership impulses always put her in the center of organizing and speaking. So I chose her to have her front and center, looking directly at the audience. Weil was a mover and shaker her entire life, following in her mother's footsteps in fighting for social welfare at an early age. She continued working for change until she died in 1971. The next quilt is by Martha Wolfe, and it's another, of course, I don't have favorites, but I love the story behind this one. We got laughing the other day about who would we really like to go back and meet. And Sarah Bard Field is one of those women who she just must have been such a kick. In Martha's words, my quilt honors suffragist Sarah Bard Field and her cross-country automobile journey, delivering a petition with more than 500,000 signatures supporting the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to Congress and to President Woodrow Wilson. The petition was started in January 1915 by the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, also called the CU, at their Freedom booth at the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco. In a gesture to heighten awareness to the movement, Alice Paul, co-founder of the controversial CU, asked Field, a committed suffragist and human rights activist, to escort the petition across the US, gathering signatures as she went. And they went across the country from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. in this car. On a personal note for the artist, Sarah Bard Field was her grandmother's first cousin. And in her words, I can remember hearing tales about her told with great admiration. As a nod to our family connection, I took fabric and lace from one of my grandmother's dresses to fashion Sarah's blouse. The background is made up of antique quilt squares from the early 20th century and layered with silk organza and quilted. Patricia Malacher, in her homage to Lucy Burns, addresses the violence that was done against women who were fighting for the 19th Amendment. In her words, many suffragists were arrested for protesting in public places and sent to jail, where they were often treated like hardened criminals. Lucy Burns spent more time in jail than any other suffragist. She even spent one night handcuffed to an overhead bar in her cell. In my quilt, I took advantage of the visual correspondence of silver mylar strips and prison bars, as well as the sense of grimness suggested by black, brown, and white discharged fabric. Laura Wasilewski chose to honor Jane Addams, a most dangerous woman. Jane Addams was an American settlement activist, peace activist, reformer, social worker, sociologist, and advocate of women's suffrage. As co-founder of Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago, Illinois, she focused on the needs of children, women, immigrants, and workers. Addams was a vocal fighter for the oppressed and marginalized. She advocated for public health reform, universal suffrage, child labor laws, and world peace. One reason I chose her for my quilt is that they live in Chicago, where Hull House is located. And there are several quilts that honor groupings of women, and Carol Breyer Fallert's is one of them. In her words, a photo dated June 2nd, 1920, of 6 officers of the National Women's Party standing in Washington, D.C., holding a banner with a quote by Susan B. Anthony, reminded me of quilters holding up a quilt for show and tell. So I designed a grandmother's flower garden quilt with that quote in the border. In the hexagons, you will find pictures of 20 women who have moved forward the cause of human rights in the last 100 years. And the names of 142 others who have accomplished important firsts. And those 142 others are under the flap. The 162 first ladies and their accomplishments are shown when you lift up that flap. And because we are a museum and we don't touch the quilts on our walls, I did a special label listing those 142 other women that hangs to the right of the quilt. This is our last quilt, and it is another group quilt. Susan Shy did Charlotte, Knight of Potholder Coins in the kitchen taro. Charlotte Woodward Pierce is my suffragist, and as an aside, I'm really glad she chose her because of this. I was intrigued about this youngest woman to attend the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention at the age of 18, and she was the only one of those women still alive when women won the right to vote in 1920. But at age 91, she was bedfast and unable to vote. Other women depicted here are Stacey Abrams, the Statue of Liberty, Representative Shirley Chisholm, Hillary Clinton, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the 102 women of the 116th House of Representatives elected in November 2018. These women of the new House of Representatives seemed perfect to go with my suffragist subject here, as they wore white on the night of the 2019 State of the Union speech to honor the suffragist movement. There are many other wonderful quilts in this exhibit, and I want to thank you for attending our quick history lesson through art. The book is available through Amazon. It includes all of the images, artist statements, and there are appendices with lists of more suffragists as well as the bibliography. We currently have the exhibit up at the New England Quilt Museum, currently through September 26th. The schedule may change as COVID affects more and more of our museums in negative ways, and the place to see the updated schedule is on Sandra's website, sandrasider.com. And again, one more round of applause to eQuilter for the sponsorship of this wonderful exhibit. And thank you all.
Thank you so much, Pam and Alice. I wanted to start because one of the questions came up about given their own topic or given a list or choosing their own topic. And Deb and I already said that we had our person, already on our design wall in another context. But how did you sort of develop the list, and what were you trying to do with the list? It's interesting to be just the one element and then to see the entire exhibition go, oh, wow, I see how we fit in. But I'd like to know how you and Sandra thought about that.
Well, I'm very old and have a very bad memory, but what I remember about this process 3 years ago is that Sandra and I divvied up 15 artists. My parameter was that I knew that the person, that's weird, the person had to be known to me to be working figuratively. And that's how I chose my list of 15, work that I admired. I don't think we gave a specific list unless Sandra did and I'd forgotten about it, but it was required that it be an American suffragist, and that you all develop a short essay on your work, something about your work and why you chose the person that you did. And then a little tiny detail, we shifted right away to use the word suffragist because the American press started calling the girls suffragettes, which at the time was a derogatory statement. So it was to be about suffragists.
Can I tell you why I chose Ida B. Wells?
Please.
well, I think we got the list, and I saw her name on it. I was already familiar with Ida B. Wells, but not in the context of suffrage. I had no idea that she was a suffragist. She was very famous as in the anti-lynching campaign. She was a editor of a newspaper in Memphis. This is a woman who was born at the beginning of the Civil War, in the middle of the Civil War. She was the editor of a newspaper. When 3 of her friends, Black friends, were lynched, essentially because a white store owner competitor of theirs didn't like the competition, they were lynched. And so she began doing research into lynching. She began printing editorials on it and saying what the true motivation behind many of these lynchings were. Such that this was in Memphis, a mob got together, burned down her newspaper. She eventually moves to Chicago, and with Jane Addams was one of the people who was responsible for desegregating Chicago schools. And I also chose her because my mother's name is Ida B, and my mother's from Memphis also. So, and I used to be a journalist. So, I don't know, it was too many coincidences. I just had to do her, so.
So since we're talking about, since Alice is speaking currently, Pam, could you tell us about how many Black artists did you query for a piece in this exhibit? Did you specifically seek out Black artists?
No, but through my reading by that time, I knew that the Black suffragist subject had been neglected and buried. So it was important that there be some representation. I would have to admit that Sandra was probably more cognizant of actively inviting Black artists than I was.
And can you, in a general way, talk about the variety of techniques that were used? Like, did that play a role in how you selected the exhibition? Was that part of it, or did you really go mainly on the theme of the particular piece?
So again, my criteria was that the person was well known working figuratively, and that in the people who I invited, I knew I was inviting people who worked mostly with raw edge applique. I knew I was inviting people who did a lot of thread painting. I knew I was inviting some people who were dye painting. I don't remember if Hollis Chatelaine, for instance, was on my list or Sandra's, but you know her work and how figurative it is and how unusual at the time she started doing it her method was. So I just wanted a good representation with different media, and it's all over the map. There's a lot of photo transfer, there's some raw edge applique, there is some thread painting, but I think it's a wonderful representation of the different, and you guys with your computer, your computer modulated is the word, not the right word, but manipulated images. Just a wonderful representation of techniques.
Yeah, and Sandra Sider also mentions that you tried to get Black male artists as well.
We did. We did.
And you did. So because you definitely have Arturo Sandoval, and is there someone else I'm missing? Oh, John Leffelholtz?
Yes, John Leffelholtz.
His name correctly, yeah. And there are some specific questions because we do have a few minutes. I'll try to get to some of the specific questions, like us readers here are dying to know what's the name of the novel about the Grimm Sisters.
You know what? I just remembered it a few minutes ago. It was a historical fiction novel, and the main character is one of their slaves. It's written from her perspective. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. I think I read it 4 or 5 years ago, and I almost forgot about it until like yesterday. So it's
okay. So we're going to Google Grimm Sisters novel,
yes,
and we'll get it.
You will. And
it sounds fascinating.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, and about the stones and their wedding vows, can you speak a little bit more to that? Where you can, how that was found, that was it published somewhere in a, can you remember?
Yes, I can. And because in preparation for this talk, I went back through and just using good old Google, I was worried that I had not included the birth and death dates of many of these women. So I went back and included those in my notes. There's a wonderful website, the Museum of Women's History has 5 or 6 paragraphs on each of these women. And I'm sure that with more search, you can find a lot more resources about all of them. So Lucy Stone was born into a middle-class Massachusetts family. She was smarter than her brothers, but they were allowed to go to college and she was not. So she taught until she saved enough money to enter Oberlin. And she basically, we would call it work study today. She cleaned dormitories during the night and attended classes during the day. It took her several years to finish college. She taught for a while. She was pursued mightily by several young men and only agreed to marry, last name Blackwell. He was the brother of the first 2 female physicians, oh, I hate my memory. Anyway, that's not important to her story. But she only agreed to marry him if she could have an unconventional marriage. And the conditions were that she would retain rights to whatever property that she had. She would not use obey in her marriage vows, and she retained her last name.
Can I tell you about the Grimm Sisters?
Yes.
Did you find it?
It's a novel by Sue
We
Monk.
have a great audience.
It was a novel by Sue Monk Kidd, which I didn't know
Yes.
that, called The Invention of Wings.
Yep, that's it.
Perfect.
It's wonderful. It's
Yeah.
wonderful.
So your little information about suffragette versus suffragist and how that came about has been sparking a few comments. And what do we think about the language today? Should we be talking about slave versus enslaved person? What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Alice, you wanna reach for that question?
I always bow out of these things because I got too many things to fight about that I do not need to fight about little elements of language, slave, enslaved person, yada, yada, yada. I let other people fight those things. There's so much going on out there that deserves my attention. I don't care. So that's just me.
Pam, what are your thoughts?
I started using enslaved person or formerly enslaved person.
I mean, if you know from Deb's and my work, we really are interested in language and how language works and what language evokes. So to really make a concerted effort to think about the way you do approach certain heated or dicey words, I think is really important for all of us to do. So I had not until really today thought about the difference between slave and enslaved person, and also just the way we slave. I'm a slave at work, and no, you're not. You're right. So it's just the way we use language, or the easy way we use language that for forever has included the way we just absorb without even thinking racist and misogynist thought. My sister and I just were talking the other day, and I said, "You remember when we were little and we got mad at somebody?" Oh, I'm old, by the way. So when we were little, we got mad at somebody. We could hear people say, "Get your cotton picking hands off me." And neither one of us ever realized until we were adults what that meant. We had no clue, because it's just so natural, unfortunately, right? So I think sometimes it is important to try to think about the language we use. I just want to give a shout out to Constance, who had the privilege of seeing the exhibit at the New England Quilt Museum already when it first reopened. And she says it's well worth the trip to see the exhibit. Well done. And we on the West Coast are keeping our fingers crossed about being able to see the exhibit live in San Jose, but we are all very practical and realistic. Not only are we in a pretty hot bed of COVID over here, but because of all the wildfires, you know, people really aren't traveling because of the air quality. So, you know, all that's going to play a role in whether or not we can see it. And so can you maybe give a couple minutes to maybe bringing this exhibition through the civil rights movement and today's movement? I mean, we've lost so much of what was gained, especially since the civil rights movement, about suffrage in general and women in particular. Can you draw a thread, perhaps, Pam, to today?
The first thread that pops up is that comment that I made earlier about the founders punting or drop kicking voters' rights to the individual states. And with so much that goes on in our society, it should not depend on your zip code what your rights are. I feel very fortunate in New England to have been brought up in, I was brought up as an old-fashioned Republican business family, but from a very early age, my dad looked at me, I'm the oldest of four, and said, you can be whatever you want to be. Now, is that a New England thing? Is that a Northern thing? Is that an enlightened father thing? I don't know. But it just seems that there's still so much regionality that we're fighting with rights for education, with rights for employment, with rights for economic opportunity, as well as in our birthright. What color is your skin and what rights do you have because you're Black, brown, Asian, or Latinx? It's actually something, I'm still kind of stuck in the 1920s with this, Kris, but I am convinced that we have so much more work to do. I'm just beginning to look, it's one of the things that has come out of this for me is where are we really with the Equal Rights Amendment? Has it been passed by the right number of states? Why has it not been written into the Constitution? What's holding us back about equal rights for women?
So, yeah. So the use of language seems to be popping up again and putting the onus, making a difference between me and Alice on the use of words. I don't see myself as a privileged white person, for one, to be tying myself up all in a knot. I see myself as a language person and a linguist, and the importance of words and how words can hurt. So I just want to say that. But I do want to add, to move on, I want to add that Marion Coleman, one of our beloved SACO colleagues who passed away a while ago, was actually working on a piece for this exhibit. And I'm sorry, I have to go back a little bit in the notes to find exactly the topic. Deb, can you see it? It was about do you remember, Pam, what she was working on? But she was working on enslaved peoples. And it's just a reminder of us how fragile life is and what a loss that was to lose Marion at this time. Yeah. So we know that the ERA was passed to, I don't know, was it passed in enough states to meet the requirement?
It has been, but not in the deadline required.
Yeah.
So do you know, for example, what has to be done to lift the time limit, or do we have to go through the entire process again?
My guess would be, I think, so if I remember correctly, it's been, the timeline has been extended once, and I wonder if it can be legally extended again. Mm-hmm. But again, it's something that I'm just beginning to research, so I don't have an adequate answer for you. I wonder if one of our listeners does.
We're looking, but it's surprising how quickly these the questions are coming through. We've got the Q&A, which is where we're hoping people would put their questions, and then the chat, which is where a lot of the questions are ending up. So we're looking at two screens here. So I don't see an answer on that one right now. So in closing, Alice, what do you think? I know that both you and the Pixeladies are involved in another exhibition about suffrage. And could you just quickly tell us what piece what the topic of that piece is and how you fit that together with the piece you did on Ida B. Wells for this exhibition.
Right. Well, I picked Ida B once again, but I made a very different quilt. I'm so fascinated by her. So this is it's for a exhibition that will be at the Clinton Library someday when that reopens, and you know, everything's up in the air. And in that one, I would put it up on the screen, but I don't think I have display privileges here. I'm showing a group of Black women on one side, a group of white women on the other side, and the one or two of the white women are taunting the Black women. So this is again about the same issue, but told from a different perspective, and you know, it's just a different quilt.
That's interesting because Deb and I, because we did Catherine McCormick, when we were asked to do a piece for this other exhibition, we wanted to do the counterpoint to this wealthy, privileged white woman. And so in discussion with those organizers, we picked Fannie Lou Hamer. And so for us as a personal growth, as a personal, artistic vision, it really felt important to kind of give these two sides and how, despite how different they were, what unified them was this focus on gaining rights for their people, whether it be women, whether it be Blacks, whether it be, it was that focus and commitment to suffrage and civil rights and women's rights. So that's how we came about picking another one. Do you, Pam, we're at their hour. Let me just add that Marion was doing a piece on Mary Ann Shadd Cary, C-A-R-Y. So that might be another person for those of you to research if you would like. And did you want to close, Pam, with anything about just being able to see the exhibition live? What do you feel is the one thing that we're missing out on right now on the West Coast, since you have it there in New England?
You are missing the warm glow that the faces of the women and the women depicted in the quilts it just emanates through the gallery. If you can see the screen behind me, we're a very intimate space, and it almost feels in some cases that I can walk up to a quilt and have a conversation with the suffragist that's depicted in the piece. Of course, part of that has to do with all the background reading I did and my familiarity with these characters. But it's just to see it in person is, you see the detail. Some of the quilts that I didn't even show have hundreds of images on them and words and photo transfer, and you can just stand and transfixed looking at all the details of every image.
Okay, so there are. Go ahead, Alice.
I just wanted to address that one other thing. I see Patricia Montgomery put in both the chat room and the Q&A, so I'm going to try to answer your question. She's saying, what, if any, I think, effect did the civil rights movement have on suffrage? And, you know, that's such a long question, because abolition, efforts against toward abolition, you know, date back to the 1700s, you know, and forward. And so you had abolitionists who were trying to end slavery, you know, trying to do that. And then you had people working for Reconstruction, including Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and people like that during that period. And then you've got the modern civil rights movement. Well, women had the vote by then, you know, and so there was no real effect on white women of the civil rights movement. Although it's interesting to note that the accomplishment of the civil rights acts from Reconstruction, the 18th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and so forth, have redounded to the benefit of white women Very much so, because that's a equal rights, and it's due process, and and things like that. So those things that were adopted for the purposes of correcting some of the wrongs of slavery have redounded to the benefit of all people. So didn't quite work the other way, so that the white women in the suffrage movement didn't exactly turn around and say, "Oh, we got our vote here. How can we help?" They were kind of gone by then, but obviously white people were very, very instrumental in the civil rights movement of the 60s and so forth, 50s, 60s, and today.
So in closing, I just want to remind everyone that sandrasider.com is where Sandra Sider is keeping an updated list of where the exhibit will travel. I can't tell you offhand whether it's going to the Midwest. Pamela, do you have a because of COVID and because of the the lag in openings, it would be helpful to go to Sandra's website, and she has the up-to-date of when things will go. And so when San Jose knows whether or not it can hold the exhibit live, we'll let you know. So thank you again, Alice and Pam, for this amazing journey about suffrage. And the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles will be sharing the presentation. SACA will be sharing the presentation on YouTube and Facebook. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to become a member or donate to any one of our consortium, you can visit their websites. And thanks again for all our sponsors for making this event happen. We look forward to seeing you next week at the next Textile Talks. You can find the list also on all of the supporting and participating organizations. So thank you, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to answer your question. There were just too many, which is a good thing. So thank you once again. Take care, everyone.